knows about jokes. This time the joke is on me. Well, I have no clue about that. I have no clue about.
You know, this is story and imagination and telling our pasts and predicting our futures. That's the magic of why we get into this business.
I really wish I would have taken myself seriously as somebody who could make art earlier in my life. I didn't know anybody who made money creatively.
Audiences want to see things that are new. I want to go see a story I've never seen before, and that's what we're betting on.
As you join us today, we encourage you to reflect on the land that you're on and its history. We're located on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee. The territory is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant and is home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We're grateful to work on this land.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the industry conference so far. My name is Keith Benny. I'm the Senior Director of Public Programming here at TIFF. My team and I oversee the TIFF Next Wave program for young creators, community impact initiatives, and our film reference library on the 4th floor of TIFF Lightbox. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's Visionary session with Pete Docter. First off, I'd like to extend a thank you to all those who support what we do here at TIFF. A sincere thank you to our presenting sponsor, RBC, our major sponsors, Rogers and Visa, and our major industry supporters, Ontario Creates and Telefilm Canada, and our media partner, The Hollywood Reporter, for supporting the Visionaries program. As the creative mind behind Pixar's award-winning Slate, Pete Docter is renowned for his ability to bring animated films to life with emotive storytelling and compelling visuals, which have captivated audiences around the world. As the 10th employee in Pixar's animation group and its 3rd animator, our conversation will delve into his journey at the company, insights into his creative process, and how he continues to redefine cinema on a global scale. I think the best way to introduce Pete or to reintroduce him is to revisit Pixar's incredible work on screen. So let's take a look. Please join me in welcoming Pete Docter.
Thanks. What's everybody doing here? Could be watching movies.
We're here for you. We're taking a break from the movies. Thank you for joining us here in Toronto. That reel is really staggering. I don't know if anyone else gets choked up immediately when you hear the theme from Toy Story. I know I do. But the number of iconic characters you and your colleagues have introduced, the places you've taken us, and if you haven't contributed to every movie at Pixar from over 30 years, nearly every movie as a writer, or as a director, as a producer, executive producer, and you directed for the studio Monsters, Inc., Up, Inside Out, and Soul, the last 3 of those winning the Best Animated Feature at the Oscars. Of course, you helped bring to the screen Inside Out 2 this summer, which isn't just the summer box office hit, but has been said to have saved the summer box office. So thank you for saving us. And yeah, please. So we're going to touch on all of that, or as much of it as we can today. But I do want to start at the beginning, because I feel like it's always helpful to know where someone comes from before we see all this amazing work in front of us. And so I wanted to know, as a kid, what types of movies or television you gravitated towards, and what stuck out to you as a young one.
Well, I grew up in Minnesota, Canadian Annex, and I'm a musical family. My parents are both musicians, my sisters are musicians. I'm sort of the black sheep of the family that didn't go into music. So I spent a lot of time, frankly, being bored at long classical music concerts and gathering all the programs and drawing. And that's really how I got into this, is out of boredom. And I really feel like we got to bring back boredom, because it's the key to creativity. And so if everybody's on their phones all the time, they're never bored, they're never challenged to create something themselves. So there you go. Right out of the gate. Lecturing people right out of the gate, sorry. I guess the things that really got me excited were The Muppet Show. I loved that program. And then anything Disney. I loved the Walt Disney Presents, the theme parks. We would drive across the country in the summer to visit relatives, and the high point was never seeing my grandma. I was going to Disneyland, sadly. And then I think the Warner Brothers cartoons, like Bugs Bunny, Chuck Jones films, that was a huge influence as well.
Yeah. Do you have a sense at that age, like, what it was about those portrayals, like the emotional resonance, the character development, or just that you like to draw that drew you into those in particular?
I mean, I think probably like a lot of people, I was intrigued by the magic of the technique, the fact you could make something look like it was alive. But really what stuck with me was the characters. And I think that's why the Muppets are still some of the greatest of all time. These characters that have such immediate, like you get them right away, and then they have layers and depth, you know? And that's what we try to do with our stuff too.
Did you have a favorite Muppet?
I think the one I related to most was Fozzie Bear, this guy desperate to be up there and entertain people and yet desperately insecure at the same time. So that was, and I think that is probably fairly common for animators. We have this desire to entertain people, and then you get in front of people and you're like, I think I'll go hide behind the chair. You know? It's I think why we draw then, you know, it's a way to do that.
Yeah. Speaking of drawing, you mentioned you like to draw, and you created a flip book. Was that something? How did you kind of fall into creating flip books or your own animations?
Well, I'm old enough to not have a lot of technology, have had technology at my fingertips. So the only way I could really get stuff to look like it was moving is to, you know, in the corners of my math book, start drawing and, whoa, it looks like alive. So that's kind of how I started, and then I used my father's Super 8 camera to try to film it. And anyway, yeah, I mean, I think the thing that continues to amaze me with flip books are that it's like 15 cents worth of paper. And with that, you can create a compelling story, or at least a joke, and movement, you know, a sense of character and thought. You know, that's ultimately the thing that continues to really get me jazzed, is the idea that we're creating these illusions, these things that don't exist anywhere, but that you are compelled to believe in and understand nuance about these mythical creatures, how they feel and how they think. And that's, you know, I was lucky enough to get to know, I'm sorry, I'm going way off now. Get to know some of the old animators at Disney, like Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnson, and they would talk about, don't draw what a character looks like, draw what they're thinking. And that idea of bringing you inside the experiences of these people. I think that's what all cinema, what all entertainment is trying to do, is to get you to step into someone else's experience and understand their story, you know, through their shoes.
Yeah, it sounds like, I mean, you're articulating the ethos of why you do what you do, or how you and your colleagues think about what it is to create at Pixar.
Yeah.
When you were younger, was there any moment where it clicked for you that this could be a career, that this could be a path that you wanted to pursue?
No, I never thought that you could actually make a living doing this. I just did it for fun. Like, I made my own films growing up, and then I looked for college that I could continue to do that. And it wasn't until like I was halfway through going, oh wait, maybe I could actually get paid to do this instead of just doing it for the joy of it. And sometimes I still forget that I'm getting paid, because it's fun most of the days. Yeah. Actually, less so in the job I'm in now. But as an animator, as a writer, director, that's the fun part.
And so you alluded to college. Cal Arts is where you went, and you made some short films there that really attracted attention. And you then joined Pixar after graduating in 1990. What were those early days like at Pixar for you?
It felt kind of like an extension of school. In fact, I got married pretty quickly after school, and I would say goodbye to my wife. I'm going to school. I mean, work. I would just it felt very similar because it was just a bunch of people making stuff for fun. And in fact, when Toy Story came out, sorry if I'm jumping ahead, but it was kind of shocking because I felt like we were just making this for ourselves. And the fact now there were billboards and my friends were talking about it, I was completely surprised. So it just, I guess, directly to answer your question, it felt like a bunch of people doing this because we loved it.
Amazing. And, 1995, Toy Story comes out. It was kind of a watershed moment. It feels like, animation was changing in that moment, technically, narratively. How did you, first start working on the project and kind of grow into becoming an integral member of bringing that to the screen?
Well, so I started at Pixar in 1990, and that we were doing short films and commercials. And so I got to witness as John Lasseter and others would shop around to different studios. And so when we got a deal with Disney, that was in 91, 92, and we started, so it was basically anybody who was there started working on it. And because we didn't have specialization then, anybody who's there was doing character design, was doing storytelling, was doing animation, everything. So now, of course, I think we have 1,100 people, and your job is very specific. So if you're someone who does the cloth simulation, that you do that, or you do story or animation. It's all kind of broken down. But at that time, it was kind of whoever could do it was doing it.
It's like all hands on deck.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Is there anything in that film that you're most proud about having contributed or helping resolve something that made it into the final film?
I mean, the fact that it exists is kind of shocking because, so just by way of contrast, our films generally now, average is about 5 years to make, and I think about 350 people. That film was 120 people and 3.5 years. So the fact that it exists at all and had never been done at that scale, we didn't know what we were doing. I remember literally having a meeting beforehand saying, how many animators will we need to do a feature? I think 7. 7 would probably do it.
Wow.
And we thought we could have one person who's doing camera, essentially. Of course, all those numbers doubled, quadrupled, et cetera, since then. But
when you're starting out, you don't know what you don't know, right? Yeah. You've said before that it hasn't been your intention to create stories that message something profound, that, but with your films, of course, I'm thinking of Up and Inside Out, they resonate with audiences so incredibly deeply. What do you think the secret is to that formula of creating films that connect in a profound level, but don't, hit their audience over the head with the message that you want to say?
Yeah, it's a good question, because as you say, I don't want to be lecturing at people. On the other hand, I'm not making these movies for me. I'm making them for you, for the audience. And so you want to be aware of how people receive stuff. But I also feel, and I've told the directors that I get to work with, I think our job is to know better than the audience what they will like. I kind of think of it a little bit like I'm handcrafting a present for my friend for Christmas. And I want them to know that it's from me, but I want them to really love it. So what kind of gift will that be, and how do I craft this and tailor it so that it's well received, is kind of the way I look at it. And it's definitely a balance back and forth. It can't all be me pontificating, nor can it be all just going for jokes. I think it's got to be, you got to feel the weight, I think, of a person behind the movies. That's why people like going to see the movies, I think.
It's a very Libra response to finding balance within things. You've talked before about bringing the personal into your work, how elements of Up and Inside Out were inspired by things that happened to you in your own life. How do you approach using your own lived experience to tell the stories you want to tell, leaning into that, but also making it feel as if it's still universal enough that an audience will see themselves in it?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's one that we continue to struggle with and grapple with. And I think we have a lot of, first of all, I think it's temperament. There are, I think, this can go negative, but sometimes people who really want to please other people end up doing a good job in this role, because that is the role, is to make the movie for the audience. I think too, you know, then when you get in there, we have these processes that not just refine the project, but widen it. So I don't know, maybe you guys all know this. The way we write scripts, of course, but then we make reels. We call them reels, or animatics. And we sit in the screening room, much like this, and we watch a kind of a comic book version with temporary dialogue and music. And it's a, you know, pretty accurate representation of the film. And then we all turn to each other and say, okay, what worked, what didn't, how can we make it better? And we do that for 2 or 3 years through 8 or 9 different versions of the film. So by the time you see it, it's not the first time we made it, it's like the 9th time. And I think that process makes the films better, but it also, to your point, makes them wider. Because if I make something it makes me cry, but everyone else is like, I don't get it. You know, I know that I missed, right? I gotta figure out how to get to them, how to reach them. So that process, I think, whenever people ask me about making their own films, I'm like, yeah, you gotta be brave and show it to people, because, and that's why these festivals are so awesome. You know, it sucks. The reality of the world is you make something, you put it on YouTube, and you don't, I mean, somebody's gonna quote or comment, but you don't really get to watch it with them the way you do here. And I think that really trains you as a filmmaker.
Yeah. Your response there reminds me of something that Kevin Nolting said. He was at TIFF a few years ago, you know, editor that you've worked with, longtime collaborator. He said that in live action, you shoot the film first and then you edit after. And in animation, you edit the film first, you know, the storyboarding and these reels that you're mentioning, and then you shoot. And so, yeah, it's a really interesting way to think about the process and how different it is from live action.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. I mean, you know, you guys being film buffs, I'm sure you know, like the shooting ratio is something that people talk about. How many takes or footage did we use versus what ended up in the film? For Up, we had 1 shot that we didn't use. So we nearly had a 1-to-1 shooting ratio, which is crazy, but that's only possible because of the many, many versions of storyboards that we dumped and burned and stomped on.
Yeah. Going back to that kind of idea of bringing the personal into your stories, I want to give a shout out to one of our own hometown heroes, Domi Shi, who grew up in Toronto, went to Sheridan College, and so I know, you know, as you've grown into your role, or your roles evolved at Pixar, mentoring the next generation of animators and storytellers has been really important. And so, yeah, wondering how you know, identify that talent, but then also, you know, work with them to find the story that they need to tell, and yeah, what that process is like to mentor someone like Domi through that.
I think I had this idea as a kid that there were these geniuses who just had this idea, and it would be like Dumbo, and it would be just all there in his head. Walt would just tell everybody, hey, here's how we do it. The reality is, and this is true both for Disney and for us today, it's iteration. It's less about talent at some point and more about stamina. And so with Domi, and this is emblematic of how we generally work, we had asked her to, well, she had done a short film, so we knew, okay, this person has some real skill. But instead of just saying, what's your idea that you want to make, we said, go to development, pitch 3 different ideas, 3 completely different ideas. And so you take them, you know, I think that took her like 4 or 5 months. She's very quick. And then she would bring us in the room and pitch these different ideas, and we kind of gravitated towards Turning Red. And then from there, you continue to iterate, and she works with, as we all do, writers and other creative collaborators. Identifying her, I had worked with Domi on Inside Out, so I saw firsthand what she was able to bring, her sense of character and quirkiness and charm to the sequences that she did. So usually that's kind of how it works. It's like you just work with somebody and you're like, something about that person.
Yeah. We touched on Toy Story, Up, Inside Out, Turning Red. Within the studio, what is the key to determining which stories to develop and how to know when it's the right story to tell at the right time?
I think if we could have controlled all that, we would have a different slate and history entirely. A lot of it is just like, okay, the forces conspired to do this story right now. And I also believe that movies, kind of like human beings, they have a spirit of their own. And our job is to dig that out and make it as good as, it's not like predestined at all. I think you can make it into a good idea into something really kind of crappy or vice versa. But, you know, some movies just seem like they're wild stallions ready to go. And others, you have to kind of push out onto the track, and then they sort of stumble around for a while, and then finally you get them going. So it's really, I think, especially in the role I'm in now, trying to have some semblance of creative discipline, but also allow for the wild, untamable nature of these things.
Right. Yeah, and I guess given the gestation period, the 5-year period, that, you know, the length of time it takes for something to actually reach an audience is, you know, so much can change in the world, so yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like Inside Out, I think Inside Out 2 obviously struck a chord with people because of anxiety. I don't think 5 years ago, well, 5 years, well, it was a little longer than that. When we'd asked Kelsey Mann, the director, to go think of some ideas, and even then we were pretty clear, like, if you don't come up with anything we all love, we won't make it. So it's not like, no matter what, we're doing something. We're only gonna do this if we feel like we have something. And he had a pitch that got very specific about that sense of angst that happens when you are a teenager, a sense that I'm not worthy, everybody's looking at me and judging me, and so that ended up being very topical, unfortunately, but hopefully helpfully.
Yeah.
A lot of times Soul was way before George Floyd and all of that, but ended up being very prescient at the time that it came out, so some of it's just kind of luck, I think.
Yeah. I think this is a good segue to start talking about Inside Out 2. And you know, it's September, and the film was released in June, so it's been a few months, but I wanted to remind you of some of its success, because it's really, really something. It had the biggest global animation opening of all time, $292 million. It's the highest grossing animated film of all time globally. It's currently the 9th highest grossing film in global box office history. The first animated feature to gross $1 billion at the international box office, and it reached it in 19 days. I think we should take a moment to celebrate that. That's quite an achievement. You know, you talked about how Kelsey kind of helped crystallize the theme. Had you always wanted to revisit Riley's story and the characters that we know and love?
No, making the film for the first time, I was happy just to finish it, that one, and have something that made some sort of sense, because it's a complicated concept and world. So we didn't consider anything until, you know, it was 2 or 3 years later, and I was still getting people saying, you know, Inside Out really changed the way I think and bring up my kids. I'm like, that's a pretty wild thing to say about a cartoon. Maybe there's more to be done here. And so, as I say, Jim Morris, who's president of Pixar, and I sat down with Kelsey, who had done head of story. He was the head of story on Monsters University, as well as Onward. And I just seen him bring such energy and enthusiasm and vibrancy to both those films. And so we said, well, go think of some ideas. And so he then ran with this, and you know, I was obviously, having been the first one, directed the first one, to his credit, Kelsey was like, I want to keep you tethered at the hip, because I want this to feel as authentic and truthful to the first film as I possibly can. So I was very fortunate to help out all the way along.
Amazing. And upon hearing that first pitch from Kelsey of anxiety and starting to think through it, and what was your initial reaction to it? And then how did you work with him to turn that concept into like a character, a physical character? And thinking about actually the Muppets, anxiety feels to me like maybe the most Muppet of the characters.
Yeah, it's true. Well, like all of our films, we went through a lot of iterations before we arrived at anxiety. And this was true on the first film, Inside Out. The first film, for a long time, was joy paired with fear. So, we go on these long detours in an attempt to find the core of it. In this film, Inside Out 2, they had, for a little while, they played with shame, a character named Shame and Guilt. There was another one, I've forgotten. So there were 3 or 4 versions before we really arrived at anxiety as the character to represent this thing that, the way Kelsey pitched it was, he showed pictures. He said, I found these pictures. I was at home, and here's me as a 3-year-old, and there's him in front of a cake, and everybody's singing, and he's got this huge smile. And then here he is at 7, he's got a little bit less of a smile, and then he's like 11 and 15, and he looks miserable, like does not want to be there, doesn't feel deserving of all these eyeballs on him. And I remember feeling that myself, and I thought, okay, if there's at least 2 of us, this is probably something that is more universal. And we started playing with that general idea that happens. I think it's kind of, it's when you become socially aware. Up until then, you're in this little bubble and everything's great. If I laugh, it's funny. If I cry, then everybody's hurt. It's like, as a kid, as somebody, one of our consultants says, kids are professional narcissists. They are just, everything in the world is about them, for better or worse. But then at some point you come out of that. I think that's generally a good thing, that we start caring about other people and how we fit in. But it can also be a paralyzing thing if it goes too far. So anyway, that was what we got to explore on this one.
We're going to take a clip. We're going to throw to a clip in a minute, but maybe just one question, because before we watch the clip, I think it might be interesting to think about this, that I read in some of the early drafts, anxiety was moving into the territory of becoming a villain. And obviously with the finished film, they're not that at all. They take over from Joy, but they're still very much one of the team, one of the essential emotions that Riley needs. How did you recognize that this maybe character was moving in a direction you didn't want, and how you pulled back to make it to be more kind of fully developed?
Yeah, this is where research is key. And we've done research on all of the Pixar films. We're really curious, and not just once and then you're like, all right, check, done. No, you keep going back to people, digging deeper, not just skimming on the internet, because that seems very easy, but when you find someone who knows the stuff deeply and you can have a conversation with them, like in the case of this movie, it was, I'm blocking on her name now, but the expert who helped us with understand anxiety said, it's not a bad emotion. It's positive. There's a reason we all have anxiety. It's what makes us study for tests and pay the rent and do the laundry to prepare for tomorrow, because otherwise we would just slough off and it could be very bad. So a little bit of anxiety is very helpful. And it went back to our original research and realizing every emotion that we have means well. It's all there for a reason to benefit us. And I think that's one of the things that people have talked about anyway, watching the movies, is that it's sort of comforting to think that you have all these little guys in there who are looking out for you, and trying to support you in the best way they can. Sometimes it can go too far, and sometimes it can spin out, and that's where we went with anxiety. I think the clip we're going to show, well, do you want to talk about that now?
No, I actually was going to ask you to set it up, if you don't mind. So
I was just cued by spinning out. This was another change that happened very, very late. So we, last fall, had an audience preview screening, which we can talk about that too. And it went fine, but not great. And one of the failings was the ending. And I think what we realized was we really needed to make more a meal of what anxiety does and can go too far. And so I was able to get a couple of the contributors to the original film, Ronnie Del Carmen and Kevin Nolting, the editor, and we the 3 of us formed a little subgroup, and we just started spinning on this idea, which ended up in what we're going to see.
And I was told that you animated the final little moment of this.
Yeah.
Right?
I surprised Kelsey, the director, by showing up one day as an animator and showing him a sequence, or sorry, just a shot. So the last shot that we're going to cut away from is one that I did.
Amazing. Let's take a look. Inside Out 2. It's such an amazing climax, for so many reasons. There's just so much in that clip. But what resonates with me the most is that anxiety becomes such a great foil for Joy, in helping her recognize that no one's in control, you know, that they all have to cede control, and that Riley is many things. And so it just feels so powerful for that. So yeah, so thank you.
Well, thank you. It's funny, I'm watching that, I'm realizing, or I knew all the time, but just remembering the many, many contributions of so many amazing artists that make that work. You know, the music, which is done by Andrea Datzman, is just masterful where it plays and where it leaves things out. When Joy dumps underwater, I remember having a discussion with her about that. Like, that was, originally it was thought we were gonna do something big and dramatic, and she said, what if we just pull it out, have nothing there? So anyway, there's just so many people who, Ren Kleiss, the guy who did the sound design, all these people who make these medium or even small choices that end up contributing in major, major ways.
Yeah. I think many of us have had experience with people who have experienced panic attacks, whether it's a loved one or ourselves. And so what was it important to get right about depicting that on screen, both working with the mental health professionals that you mentioned, but also trying to tell that story visually? Yeah,
I think Kelsey Mann, the director, definitely identifies with anxiety. He's been very public about that, and wanting to give people tools for understanding and dealing with anxiety. So the little things of like her touching the seat kind of makes the hair on my head stand up, just because it feels like, oh, that's so real. Like just calming yourself and breathing and listening and being present. Those are things that I didn't know about as a kid, but that I'm certainly using now. Mm-hmm. So he was a very fierce advocate for the character from the beginning.
Yeah, there's a lot of intentionality in that clip about, you know, the ray of sunshine, the heartbeat, the breathing, all of the like physicality to bring Riley back to the present moment.
Yeah, and the animators too, you know, we had just such amazing talent that brought specificity to the characters. And that's something, you know, I've been lucky enough to become very good friends with Frank Oz, who is Fozzie Bear. And he talks about character specificity and these little choices. I remember he was talking about Miss Piggy, and he said the script called for Miss Piggy to punch Kermit. And instead, he said, I don't know where it came from, but she did this karate chop. And that became defining for her. And you just don't, I mean, that's what's great about working with animators and character designers and all these people. They're bringing this human element that you don't know where it comes from, but somehow that's what makes these characters really feel like they live and breathe.
Yeah. Speaking of character and nuance, I want to pause for a moment to consider the other new characters in the film. So envy, embarrassment, and ennui, all of course super entertaining and nuanced in their own right. How did you, and it sounds like you went through a process obviously, but how did you settle on these ones in particular and then think about bringing these kind of characterizations to the film?
Yeah, so again, going back to research, one of the guys we worked with, a guy named Dacher Keltner, he posited that there are 27 distinct and measurable different emotions. And so we had a lot to choose from. From the first film, I kind of distilled it down. I just looked at the list and went like, which ones would be funny to animate? And that was why we had the 5. It was not scientific. It was more just me thinking that way. This one, we tried a bunch of them, including like, I remember for a little while we had Schadenfreude, which is the fear, the taking joy in someone else's pain. And so, you know, like fear would get hurt and Schadenfreude would say, ha ha, your cries of pain amuse me. Of course, he's German, you know. But that didn't stick because too many characters in there and it just gets confusing. So we had to thin the herd. And the ones that survived, we realized, and Kelsey and his team were very good about this, that those are the socially aware emotions. So embarrassment, envy, you know, all the ones that have to do with other community that Riley is now struggling with. So it was very smart.
Right. I realize I've missed one other, which is nostalgia, that pops in every once in a while.
She was just there for the gag, but
yeah, it's a great gag. There's a really wonderful New York Times article that came out this summer that details how these two films have really helped change therapy. And you mentioned this, that, you know, parents can talk to their kids using characters in the film. But, you know, not only parents, but like mental health professionals have said that, you know, there's a common vocabulary or visual iconography that they can use to talk about emotions. And so I imagine for an artist, this must be one of the highest honors. So what does it feel like to know that your work is helping create real impact in this space?
I mean, when you say that, I'm like, but I think walking around, I'm in a sort of state of, I don't know, I feel like, I don't know that I can really take credit for the film. The film is the film, and it's, A, the product of so many people, and B, I've had this experience, which might sound weird, but when the film is done, you know, as a director of Inside Out or Up, I remember this on Up for sure, I was there for every major decision of the film, and yet when I sit in the film, in the audience with, at the end and watch it, I go, where did this come from? I know, it's the weirdest thing. It just has this life of its own, and I'm involved, but I'm sort of just swept along in the energy of making it somehow. I don't know really how to explain that.
Pixar, of course, famously believes that that animation is not just for children; that it's for everyone. And so, I'm wondering, when you create a film like Inside Out 2 and any of the others that you have, how you factor in both children and adults watching together, and how you find the right pitch for each of the films.
Well, I think for the ones I've directed, the primary audience in my head is me, which is completely contrary to what I said earlier. I recognize that.
Where'd the package go? The nice little...
But I guess what I'm thinking is like, okay, I know from experience this is going to be 4 or 5 years of my life. I want to have something that I'm looking forward to working on every day, and something that I can explore. The other thing, just as a side note, I feel like it's taken me like 25 years of work to figure this out, but making movies is a discovery. If I know exactly what I'm doing at the beginning, I think the movie's going to be dull. I think I have to allow for a process of learning and discovery within myself that the film brings out. So in making the movie, by the end, ideally, I am able to say something that I would have never understood at the beginning. And I feel like that is integral, at least for me, in making the film. And now I forgot what question you asked.
I forgot too.
Well, so...
But what you said was, I think, much more profound. That idea of discovery, I think, is really beautiful, that you set out at point A, you will get to a point B, but in there, you're going to find new things that you didn't realize.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that comes about through all the collaborative energy and all the hands that come into that.
Yeah. Oh, so, yeah, I remembered. So I'm coming in kind of selfishly, and then along the way I realized, okay, my friends are going to see this, first at work, and then in the world, and then my kids, and so on. So you end up, Dan Scanlon, who directed Onward, said he looks at it like a layer cake, where you have all these different layers. And we have processes at times where you're like, we need more physical humor. Kids are checking out, so let's go through the whole movie and look for opportunities where people can smack their face or run into something or whatever. And then we have a time where we're like, okay, I don't understand the clarity of, say, envy. So we're going to go through the whole movie. We're going to look at all the moments with envy and look for ways to crystallizing. So we take these many, many, many passes through the film.
I listed off earlier all the box office success of Inside Out 2, and you and your colleagues at Pixar are so good at achieving both, critical success, creative success, and commercial success. And so I know your role now, Chief Creative Officer, commercial success, obviously very important as well. How do you balance all of those things through when you're developing a film? Do you think about them actively, or is story kind of the leading kind of guiding light?
Yeah, I think, I'll stick to this thing that I said before, which is I do think it's our job to understand more than the audience does at the beginning what it is that we're giving to them, or what they want. And so we trust, and we have to trust our own instincts for whether we think something is working. We have, as I said, these multiple screenings where we show each other, and that's a very clarifying thing usually, because usually what happens is, everything is great until you have to show it to someone else. And in your own head, it's brilliant. And then you put it up and people go like, huh? And you're like, okay, I have to go back and be more clear about this. And then it becomes, the trick is like, is this a flawed idea? Is it too specific? Or is it just the way I'm putting it across? Am I not clear in how I'm setting it up or what I'm saying about it? And that is, it usually takes some digging, because like I mentioned, we have these screenings and then we have note sessions, and oftentimes people will have these seemingly really great ideas in the room. You're like, oh, that's brilliant, I'm putting that right in the movie. And then as you think about it for more than an hour, you're like, wait, it actually doesn't work. So you have to dig for why did that seem like such a brilliant idea? What is it that they were actually, what did I feel at that moment that made me go, I want to put that in the movie? And how can I grab a hold of that, but maybe in a different way that works more fully for the film?
Yeah, and I think that is applicable to so many different creative art forms, that idea of, it existing in here, and then once it makes its way out into the world, it may change and shift, and it's a good thing.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. I want to get to some audience questions in just a minute, so get ready for that. You're now the Chief Creative Officer, as I mentioned, taking that role on in 2018. When you look back at your many years at the company and your various roles, what would you say is maybe one of the biggest things you've learned in your time, or has been kind of the biggest, most important lesson that Pixar has taught you?
I mean, there's a lot of things. One is, kind of to my point of all the creative input, I think oftentimes, especially as a young director, there's a temptation to feel like, oh, this is my baby, I've got to have the answers, I've got to solve all the problems. And then you realize, all around me are these amazingly talented people. How can I bring them in so that they are the ones solving the problems? If I can identify what the problem is and point a direction generally to go, and then unleash them, it's going to get 20 times better than anything, because I have limited skills. I can do certain things, but not other things, but I can recognize this person's great with comedy. This is a brilliant designer. This person has amazing cinematography. So, like, knowing who you have and really being able to deploy those troops to make something way better than you yourself could do, I think that's been kind of my life's journey, and I think super important as a creative leader.
Amazing. This may not be the case for you, but I feel like a lot of people, as they get more senior in an organization, they move away from what they originally were hired to do, more administration, more people management, as you mentioned. What are the ways that you try to make sure you stay creative and bring creativity into your work?
Yeah, that's definitely been something I've struggled with, and my initial thought was, because this is the way I wanted to be treated, is to just say, I'm going to leave them alone. And what I've realized is that I think I am better in the weeds at certain points. In other words, and that may, okay, so now that I say that, I don't want to send the message that I need to be involved in every detail. That's not the thing. But I do need to get this movie into my bloodstream, so that when you wake me up at 3 in the morning, I'm thinking about it. Otherwise, the good idea, I'm not a guy who's smart enough to watch a movie once and say, here's 3 notes that are going to fix it. I'm not that person. I need to get it infused into my body, and then I can contribute in better ways. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I've been trying to find ways to sit in edit, be heavily involved at key moments, but then still be as much as I can, be respectful of the director and filmmakers and their contributions, what they're trying to say with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, in case in point, you edited that final moment of the clip we saw. Like your hands are in it as well, while still providing space for someone like Kelsey to step into it.
Yeah, and I'm sure other people have different approaches, but that's been for me the way I need to work.
Okay, great. We do have time for questions, so let's. I think we have time for about 2 questions. So let's go right over here. Yep. Go ahead.
Thanks for watching.
One of my favorite projects you've worked on would be WALL-E in 2008, very ahead of its time, talking about environmental issues. We're progressively getting lazier with everything, and I thought it was so ahead of its time in terms of technology, our predictions with AI now. What was the narrative storyboarding process like for that film, and did you expect it to be so close to what we're moving towards today?
And I'll just repeat the question. Thank you for that. The question is about WALL-E and what the kind of narrative process was for bringing that story to the screen.
So it's funny, you mentioned things like getting progressively lazy and environmental issues. None of those were even part of the story when we began. The very beginning, which I worked on, was this lone robot cubing trash on basically a dump planet, a place where ships would show up and dump their garbage. And only later, I think it was Steve Jobs who said, that should be Earth, because it's so distant and foreign, people can't really relate to this story, so we need to give them a little grounding. Like, what if that's Earth? So this was as Andrew Stanton took it over and was directing, and he brought then the idea, I think again out of research, what would humans become if they lived their lives in progressive generations in space? So all those things that seem like a commentary, I might posit they actually work better because they weren't intended to be commentary at all. They were just kind of part of telling the story, but then they seem to resonate with people, but hopefully not in a sort of a finger-waggy way.
Another question? Yeah, in the green sweater there, yeah.
You talked a lot about the Reels process and the think tanks that you guys had. Just was wondering, with your experience, what makes for good feedback?
So yeah, Pete talked a lot about the Reels process and how they work on reviewing, and developing the film. What makes for good feedback? Great question.
Yeah, and there's a lot of answers to that. There's one that a friend of mine, Seth Barish, he directed a lot of Mike Birbiglia's one-man shows, and his approach is less like, I like this, I don't like this. His approach is more like, when you said or did this, I understood or felt this. Is that what you want? And half the time you're like, oh no, why were they scared at that part? I was trying to be funny, So that sort of feedback, just my experience of watching the movie was this, and parroting that back to the filmmaker, that's super helpful. I also think before people even give any notes, they're super helpful. I can't tell you how many times I've sat in a screening room like this, watched the movie, and afterwards I'm like, just don't say anything, I know exactly what's wrong. Just watching it with other people is very, very, it's like somehow your brain goes into theirs and watches the movie, and that's super helpful. And different people have different wiring. I know there's a few filmmakers that I work with that really need and enjoy very direct, this is not working. I'm not understanding this. So for me, that kind of crushes my soul. I need a little gentler, like, I really like this. It's really good. I'm like, okay, now I'm ready to listen. So you just kind of have to kind of figure out where people's sensitivity level is. But under it all, I think, though, the important thing is that you're out for the benefit of the movie, not for some self-centered interest of showing how smart you are or how you should really be directing this instead of that person.
Let's go for one more question. Yeah, you in the front here.
I also want to start by saying thank you for your films. I watched them growing up with my friends, and I want to say they changed the way I thought about life. And as a film student, I want to say, when I mean it from the bottom of my heart, you taught all of us what good films are, so thank you so much. My question is, when I watched your films, especially Soul, there were a lot of moments where I'm like, whoa, how did you think of that? I didn't even know that could be thought of. Where does that, I guess, stream of inspiration come from?
Yeah, the question is asking Pete to describe his stream of inspiration. Where does it come from?
Yeah, I forget who said this. Like, if I knew where the ideas came from, I'd go there more often. It's really more just a sense of starting. I think the real answer is you start with something, and then that maybe works, and then you dig deeper. So the whole thing is a process of layering. So by the time you see it at the end, it feels like, whoa, it must have, as I talked about before, kind of sprung from somebody's brain. That's not actually true. It's the process of making it better and better with a lot of other people that ends up, if you do it right, deepening and making something more meaningful, which is ultimately, it's funny because you want these movies to be fun and funny, otherwise people don't want to go, right? If you say, hey, come watch this movie about how we're all screwing over the world and all gonna die, people are like, pass, But if you sneak them in about it's a funny robot, then okay, I'm in, and you can get some of this other stuff. So I feel like it's always that balance of leading with candy and then giving vegetables as you go. How's that? Lead with candy and then give them vegetables.
And bring back boredom.
Yes, bring back boredom.
I think I can speak for all of us when I say we continue to be inspired and moved by the work that you and your colleagues are doing at Pixar. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Docter.